Welcome, everyone, to the Utah Statewide Needs Assessment on Domestic Violence, Sexual Violence, and Human Trafficking Community Presentation. My name is Dr. Annie Isabel Fukushima, and I'm an Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of Utah. This statewide needs assessment has been made possible due to the support of the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. We also are working in partnership, in addition to UDVC, with Restoring Ancestral Winds, UCASA, and DCFS. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us for today's presentation. I'm going to go ahead and resume this presentation. We have a ton of information to get to. I want to let folks know that if you want to access this infographic or presentation, it will be made available on the GBVC website that I will share with all of you at the end of the presentation. Additionally, I'm going to put a link in should you have to depart early for any reason. I would love to get your feedback. Let me just go ahead and make sure everyone receives this link. I want to make sure that in the chat, you'll find that there's a link that has been made available to all of you. If you have any feedback about the presentation, please do submit it to this link. It will help me to also include any kind of perspectives or examples that have not been included in today's presentation. This presentation is being recorded, and I appreciate all of you for muting yourselves and for also being present. All right. There are some concepts and terms that will be used and that include DV, sexual violence, HT for human trafficking. But generally, the purpose of this Utah statewide needs assessment is to understand the resources available to address domestic violence, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, and sexual violence in the state of Utah. There is interest in areas of gap, as well as service types, and who is being currently underserved in the state. I have put into the chat a link for folks to fill out a survey. Please join our listserv if you'd like to be up to date on the report that will be published to the Gender-Based Violence Consortium website. I welcome your feedback. All feedback that is submitted to the SurveyMonkey link will be incorporated into the final report. Today's presentation is a snapshot of what will be in the report. Obviously, for the sake of time, it won't include every single quote example that will be appearing in the report. A needs assessment is understood as a way to identify and also address needs. It is a tool for determining valid and useful problems. But overall, a needs assessment is a collection of data so we can understand what are the need for services, and it gives us a little information, or gives us information. And so for this needs assessment, the research team conducted a mixed method study to further understand the needs for service provision surrounding domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking in the state of Utah. I'm not going to go into definitions. These will appear more in a robust way in the report, but we do have particular understandings of domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. So to get us started, here we hear from a clinical director interviewed. Why do this work? Why stay? I think the magic and the beauty of what happens when we're doing this work with a lot of love and attention and care. And so I just want to remind you that while today's needs assessment will hear and bear witness to some of the challenges that people face in doing the work day to day, that there is so much good work that is also happening that has much love and care from the responders working in community. And so here we hear from a lawyer that says, so what has happened over the last 3 decades has absolutely changed how we do things. The problem is we still have so much violence. It hasn't ended. We need to make sure that what we do is effective, but frankly, we can do harm. So the needs assessment is important because it helps us to understand how we can do better in our communities. Because the reality is that there are practices that have impacted communities negatively. An overview of the methods and participants in the study. For this mixed methods study, we surveyed 293 individuals. We also conducted focus groups and interviews, which incorporates the voices of 41 individuals who participated in focus groups and interviews. The data collection period was between July and December 2021. The goal was to hear from professionals, and I'll talk more at the end about how there'll be some endeavors to hear from the voices of explicitly survivors who do not necessarily work in the anti-violence movement or as responders to violence. So there is some goals and work being done to hear from more perspectives. For the surveys, we heard from a majority of the participants, or majority of the participants identified as female, with more smaller participation from male and gender non-conforming folks. We also had diversity in sexuality, albeit 82% identified as heterosexual, with 19% identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, or queer. Our survey demographics for race was also, we wanted to hear from diversity of communities. 80% of our participants were white, with other participants, including Hispanic and Latino at 11%, with 5% identifying as two or more races, and smaller participation from Alaskan Native, American Indian, Black or African American, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islanders. Much of these percentages also reflect our populations in the state. We also heard from people living with a disability. 17% of our participants identified as living with a disability. For our interviews, the demographics for gender, we heard more from female participants and smaller participation from male identifying individuals. We also had sexual diversity with these participants, with 20% identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer. Our interview demographics, race and ethnicity also included more diversity with racial minorities participating. And so here, 72% identified as white, with 14% identifying as Hispanic or Latino, two or more races at 8%, and 5% identifying as Alaska Native or American Indian. The expertise of those that we heard from was varied, but we had a lot of expertise in those who participated in the study. Survey participants had about 9.5 years of working on issues of violence, with interviewees averaging 11 years. And so there was a wealth of knowledge from the folks that we were hearing from. We also had demographic diversity. And so here you'll see that while much of the participants were consolidated in the Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County area, there was also those who live and work in a range of contexts also participating from throughout the state. We also recognize that many people that work in the anti-violence movement identify as survivors themselves. 47% of those that participated in the study identify as survivors. So the study's context is Utah. And so just a little bit about our study context. The population of Utah hosts 3.3 million people and is growing. It grew between 18% between 2010 and 2020. Utah hosts a diversity of populations, which include Black and African American, American Indian, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, and people of diverse races as well. We wanted to understand the community's perceptions around domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual violence. So when we surveyed the responders, we queried them about what do the community believe about these issues. We found that in the response, 42% believe that domestic violence does not occur very often. And so this is the responders' perception of the community's perception. They also believe that 46% of the participants believe that human trafficking never occurs, and that they also believe that the community believes that sexual violence does not occur very often. When we try to understand what's happening, we know that domestic violence is occurring though. So while there might be a perception of our community and within community that it does not occur very often or at all, is that domestic violence is occurring. We know that 18% of Utah identifying female experience it during their lifetime. 1 in 10 men experience it during their lifetime, and that 37% transgender people experience it in their lifetime. We also know that the consequence of these issues are severe. In a study that I conducted with the Non-Fatal Strangulation Committee, we found that there were 72 cases of strangulation identified just in Salt Lake City between 2018 and 2019. We know that those that experience strangulation have high rates of homicide. They're 750% more likely to experience homicide. Organizations have been conducting LAP screenings, and that 4,485 were conducted this past year during 2021. And that 81% of those cases experienced high danger. And that data comes from Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. We also know that sexual violence is also severe. From a study conducted by Dr. Heather Melton, 40% of CODIS hits are serial offenders, and that 1 in 6 women experience rape during their lifetime. And this data can also get fleshed out to include what range of genders experience in the final report. Although human trafficking occurs in less numbers, with 64 cases reported during the last year, we know that it is occurring in the state of Utah. And that our culture, here we hear from a nurse, says the culture leads to victim blaming, quite honestly. I think that survivors oftentimes feel a lot of self-blame, which then can go into feelings of shame, which really we know mental health-wise, what those feelings of shame affect people so negatively. When we look back historically at rape laws or domestic violence laws, they stem back to times when women were seen as property. And because they were seen as property, that led to those first rape laws really being that they had to actively resist. We still see that bleeding through in our culture. And so we know the culture of our context and culture really matters. Some of the things that I was also learning in collaboration and hearing from folks is that there is a perception that the violence is more severe. Here an advocate says things have gotten to be a lot more violent. We see a lot of strangulation in our domestic violence cases. So I think as time has gone on, the crimes tend to be more violent than it did when I first started. So there is a perception that there is a lot more violence going on. Polyvictimization occurs, and this is when there are multiple forms of violence occurring in a person's lifetime. And so cases of human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual violence, although unique in how they are classified in criminal codes, do intersect for survivors at times. We know that survivors of human trafficking may also experience domestic violence and sexual violence. We also know that survivors of sexual violence may also be in a domestic violence relationship, and vice versa. And so we know that these forms of violence, while codified as different and separated out, and also having separate resources, may intersect for a variety of survivors. It's important to understand them as unique and legally different and distinct, and to also understand the different resources available in communities, but also to understand that many organizations that are working in community are responding to a variety of forms of violences, even if they have expertise or in their name are suggesting that they're responding to a specific one, that there is much overlap and crossover. In our context, we know that the technology has impacted the way that survivors experience abuse. And so that also is shared by an advocate. And that survivor, here along former law enforcement states, I'm working with 6 women fleeing domestic violence. One was fleeing a very lethal perpetrator and rented a room from a couple, and the wife left and he raped her. And because it was a primary rape case, I couldn't get her into domestic violence shelter. So we know that while there's a ton of intersecting experiences, that it may also be impacting the ability for some survivors to access resources. I'd like to now talk about marginalized communities and responding to marginalized communities in the context of Utah. There are a range of marginalized communities who reside in the state of Utah. But for today's presentation, I'll focus on Alaska Native and American Indian, BIPOC or community of colors, which stands for Black, Indigenous people or people of color. BIPOC and communities of color includes Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islander, and people who identify as BIPOC. Another marginalized community group is immigrant, those who are migrant for a variety of reasons with legal or unauthorized statuses, may speak English or English is a second language. Another marginalized population is LGBTQIA+. This includes the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual communities. And the last population that will be discussed is people living with a disability. What we learned from connecting with community about Alaska Native and American Indian communities is that there's been a ton of movement to address missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. And that this has created a ton of visibility and conversation. However, in spite of the conversations and visibility for Native American, for Alaska Native and American Indian communities, that we're still seeing a scarcity of law enforcement support, that there still needs to be more resources for shelters and advocacy in tribal communities. There was a new shelter that opened in Blanding called Gentle Iron Hawk, which is really important resource, but this is just one resource for the entire region. We also know that ongoing challenges continue to be homogenization of the distinct 8 tribal nations. They all have their own leadership and it's like we're working with different nations, and that this is something that's important to be contended with as community partners that are non-Native work with tribal communities to address violence, is that we are working with unique tribal nations. There are some trends to be shared, and that we know that 1 in 3 Native women might experience rape in her lifetime. We also know that 80% of the perpetrators are non-Native, and these statistics are really important to think about. Here we hear from an advocate who says, between Wyoming and Colorado, I'm 20 miles from both of those places, and Wyoming has over 700 Indigenous women who are missing and who have gone missing in the last decade. Nobody knows where they are, like they're just gone. As an agency, we are actively working upon fostering that relationship with our tribal community. And we know we have failed in some places, we know it. And it is something that we've been very aware of. And especially with the Gabby Petito case, we're like, wait a minute, that is a tragedy that happened, but what about all of these other people that are from our community? And so here we're hearing from communities that are really trying to work with tribal communities, but there's much to be done. We hear from a public policy expert who says, in terms of like what they recognize are some issues around data, they recognize that there's issues around jurisdiction, and the work that we've been doing is really trying to bring those together, saying when there's incomplete data or non-collection of data, these are the types of violence that happens to these communities. These different things get exacerbated. So it's important to know that even if there is missing data or a suggestion of little data, anecdotally, we know that tribal communities have been greatly impacted by violence, and that this is the ongoing challenge that communities are facing as this data becomes part of as part of the information that is needed to access resources. Here we hear from an administrator of a nonprofit who says the justice system is not very compatible with at least the culture that we work with, the Dene or Navajo culture. So that's frustrating for them. And it feels like they're re-victimized by that process pretty often. I think that there's a decent amount of implicit bias and a racism that community faces law enforcement. And there's a lot of work to be done there. And so here it's important to understand that there is also some work to be done with culture when working with tribal communities and recognizing that tribal communities are also experiencing racism. And here we hear from an administrator of a nonprofit who's talking about Alaska Native and American Indian survivors wanting to stay on their nation and that they want the resources there. However, they have to go further away to access resources and to get the care that they need. And so these are some of the challenges that we know that tribal communities are facing. I'd like to now talk about BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And that some of the things that was learned through the interviews and focus groups, as well as surveys, is that there is a lack of support groups for BIPOC or women of color. And that the communities, again, just remind us that we're speaking about include Black, American, African American, Pacific Islander, Asian, and Hispanic or Latinx. Here we hear from an advocate who says, I've talked with few people who I've identified as Indigenous, African American, and they don't feel comfortable accessing services, these whitewashed services. And so I think this is important to contend with as organizations and governments are working to support survivors of violence, that there's a need for more diverse resources for diverse communities. We also know that the Pacific Islander community is struggling as well. There's a need for more spaces for conversations to support our diverse communities. I'd like to also talk about immigrant communities. We know that 8% of the Utah population is foreign born, and that we know that abusers use their legal vulnerability to perpetuate violence. And that unauthorized communities, as well as migrant communities, live in a context of fear of law enforcement, which makes it a challenge for them to access the very resources available. There are other challenges that they face with regards to not having bilingual staff available, and that while there are language line resources available to many organizations across the state, when we think about the day-to-day resources that these communities need, there is much more that is needed than a language line. It continues to be an ongoing challenge for even common languages that are spoken like Spanish. We also know that migrant communities may stay in abusive situations because of their legal status. And so these are some of the challenges that are faced. Some of the respondents also talked about specific refugee communities who are experiencing the complexity of cultural response and as well as the dynamic of that they might experience sexual violence, whether it was before they arrived or after their arrival to the United States, and that there's a lot of trauma that they're experiencing. And that while organizations might have some bilingual staff, whether it's one or two people, it continues to be an under-resourced area of need. And so here we hear from an advocate who talks about it being really about funding, and that we do need both the linguistic support coupled with the trauma-informed care. For the LGBTQIA plus community, they continue to feel unsafe accessing services. Some of the things that we learned is that they continue to experience stigma and bias when accessing services. We know that in national trends that 26% of gay men experience IPV or interpersonal violence, and that 43% of bisexuals and 61% of lesbians experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime, and that 47% of transgender people are sexually assaulted in their lifetime. Here we hear from a government worker who talks about homeless youth that are transgender or LGBTQIA, and that they feel more marginalized in the community, but there aren't safe spaces for them. It's not safe, it's more trauma. So here they're saying, quote, it's not safe, it's more trauma. In jail, prison, and in detention facilities, they're not affirmative. We're not training spaces where harmed LGBTQIA show up to be affirmed. And so these are some important things as we do the work of understanding the needs in the communities. And so they continue to say, it's like, where are the safe spaces for an LGBTQIA child of color that's fleeing a home where they reject him or her, and then they show up at a space where they can be trafficked? It's like adding insult to injury. Some organizations are not seeing a ton of diversity in gender and sexuality in the folks that they serve. And it doesn't mean that the communities are not there. Here we hear from a therapist who says, we actually don't see a lot of trans folks in our center from what my experience would have seen. And I think that's like an area that we're trying to focus on as well. It's like, how can we better train ourselves and create a space for survivors that are transgender to be able to feel comfortable enough to receive services from us? And so again, it's getting at the data question number, which is organizations may have low numbers. It doesn't mean that the community is not there. It just might mean that the community is not accessing the resources available. So the last area of marginalized communities that I'd like to talk about are people living with a disability. 6.8% of Utahns live with a disability, with 11% uninsured. There are challenges when people living with a disability experience challenges when accessing resources that are tied to diagnosis. In a part, this might be because the resources are tied to bureaucratic boxes that they might not fit in. We also know that people living with a disability also experience being marginally housed or homeless, which then is tied to complexities of domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. Other topics that came up in interviews was with regards to service animals and survivors that have service animals and the barriers that they might face. In this part of the survey, focused more on intellectual disability. For the report, I would love to flesh it out a little bit more. We know that people living with an intellectual disability are 7 times more likely to experience sexual assault, with 40% greater chance experiencing domestic violence. Here we hear from a government worker that says there's so little awareness about the amount of women with disabilities who are assaulted. I think when people think of disabilities, they may think of someone in a wheelchair with a severe cognitive disability, but we're talking about women with autism, brain injuries, and men that they're in jails. They are the people on the streets as well. So just recognizing that disability spans across all areas, and we all are kind of responsible for making sure that awareness is out there. Other marginalized populations that came up but will not be fleshed out today are those that are living in religious communities that are polygamous. The homeless and marginally housed will be discussed in the section on needs around housing, and that we know that diverse genders also includes cisgender men or men. So now I'd like to talk about services and response. Thank you to our colleagues at the Women's Leadership Project for this resource map. You'll see that there's a range of resources throughout the state. We're very appreciative of them for mapping that resource. What we learned from interviewing and surveying communities is that in the past year, organizations experienced a ton of change. 83% of people were experiencing change. The top 4 changes experienced in the last year were policies to adapt to the pandemic. 77% of the surveyed experienced that change. New staff, loss of staff, and decrease in funds or revenue. These were the top 4 changes that communities that are responding to the needs of survivors are facing. There have been both positive and negative changes. The positive changes in the past years have included that we know that there's been a lot of discussion about the hashtag #MeToo movement, which has meant that more people are learning about the issues. Some folks talked about how Utah is moving from silence to a culture of survivors seeking services, that there have been increased in collaborations, and that with the shift to technological, connections via Zoom, we're doing it here on Zoom, is that we know that there's a flexibility in supporting survivors remotely with virtual options from Zoom, telephone to virtual support groups. And so this has created some access for people who would have otherwise not been able to connect because of childcare or for other reasons why they would need distance connection. But there have been also negative impacts. Some of the things that people were talking about was the increase in fear of lethality. There's also been an increase in complexity of cases, which requires more complex service response. Service providers have not been able to keep up with the growing needs. And so if you recall, the top four being the reduction in resources and funds is while the cases are getting more complicated, and the demand getting more, clear, the funds have not also grown. There's also technological divide and digital inequity, which means that not everyone is able to access the organizations. Some of the things that organizations also talked about was the decline in volunteers and donations. And so again, to reiterate, the increase in demand for services with the decline in financial resources is an ongoing challenge for organizations. There are barriers that survivors have when accessing services. The top 5 barriers that survivors experienced are fear of their abuser. Some of them don't want to get their abuser in trouble, lack of knowledge about resources to assist them, the lack of financial resources to leave, and not having childcare for children. Here we hear from an administrator of a nonprofit. I think for me, the lack of flexible funding or survivor-led funding that allows survivors to have control over what those funds look like. It chased me at the idea that we give funding out and tell people how they can use it. People who have been victims of abuse. I'm thinking like that's so reflective about the emotional or economic abuse that they were going through. And then we say to someone, quote, well, we're going to help you, but this is only what those dollars can do. This is only what you can do with it, and we'll only allow this to work, end quote. It really feels like, to me, like we're having a lack of understanding of the need. So this is from an administrator of a nonprofit. There are also barriers for responders in the anti-violence movement. The top 5 barriers that organizations are facing and people that are responding to the needs of survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking is that there is agency turnover, so people are leaving. There are limited funds or financial resources. Organizations just need more staff or providers. I just kept hearing time and time again how someone was the only one or the organizations only had 2 people. There's also challenges with collaboration and inadequate facilities. Here we hear from a program coordinator who says, I think there's a very strong argument to be made that if we want to provide our clients with the best services, we then need to really invest in our staff, because it's very difficult for a client who has made a relationship with, say, a case manager or a therapist, and then a month later they find out, okay, they have to start over again with somebody else. So it really does affect the services and the quality of the services that we can provide to our clients. When asked if the responders to the surveys believe that there are enough resources to support survivors, and again, this is just enough resources, this is not the quality of services. Folks are doing amazing, amazing work with the amount of resources that they have. But what we know is that we still see that 44% do not believe that there are enough resources, and that to respond to domestic violence. 53%, so nearly half, believe that there are not enough resources to respond to human trafficking, and about 40% don't believe that there's enough to respond to sexual violence. So we know that there is a need to increase resources. We know that the lack of resources impacts the ability for people to stay and do the thing that they love. And that opening quote, we know that there's a lot of love and care going into the work that people are doing. But there are reasons why people leave their organizations. And the top 5 reasons that they're leaving is that they're feeling overwhelmed or overworked. They don't have enough money, so they're leaving to go earn more money and receive better benefits elsewhere. They might lack support from leadership, and leadership can be from their organization, but it can also be leadership from the state. Um, they're also leaving because of the organization's culture and trauma from work. So these are the top 5 reasons impacting the ability for people to stay and do the work that is needed to respond to the needs of survivors of violence. Here we hear from a victim advocate that says there's a very high turnover, and I think that's because burnout is so severe. I think everyone is experiencing secondary trauma because there's just so much on your plate at all times. And I think we can all relate to that. And so the folks that are doing the work are doing amazing work and doing such important work. And I think that thinking about how they're resourced both in their care and financially is so important. And we know that organizations are figuring it out and trying their best internally. So here we hear from a victim advocate who says, we are all well supported to take wellness time and time off and flexing schedules. At the end of the day, there's 2 of us. It's difficult. So anytime I'm talking about growing staff, it's well, everybody's doing 4 jobs. And it's true. All of our offices are very lean and we have very minimal staff, which can be helpful for budget things, but it means that everyone is doing lots of different roles, and that's difficult. And so when we think about the long-term sustainability and we're thinking about the high turnover rate, it's not working. So now we're going to talk about the range of needs that survivors of violence have in the state. And it's organized to, I organized a presentation for today to talk about crisis line, housing, transportation, medical, legal, law enforcement, education, and cultural needs. But know that there are so many needs and that everything is a need for survivors of violence. They have so many needs and that every need is important. And we'll just go through it in this organized fashion. So the top 5 needs for survivors of violence, recognizing that everything is a need, but what are the top 5? These are not surprising trends. It's housing, financial, emotional support, mental health, and family. Those are the top 5 needs for survivors of violence. So what's available for crisis support? This is just a highlight of some of the lines that are available, the crisis line support from the Native Helpline, Domestic Violence Link Line, Sexual Violence Crisis Line with UCASA, and the UTIP Law Enforcement Phone Line. So again, organizations are doing fantastic work and doing the best that they can. But what makes the crisis line insufficient is that survivors are unaware of the crisis line. So there's a need for more awareness. Survivors might also fear the services due to their legal status. There's a need for more staff or providers to support the crisis line. They might have been denied services or support, or there's no interpreter translation provided. And that's really important when trying to access resources. So while there are translation services available in language lines, not everyone is accessing that. The top 2 reasons why survivors call a crisis line is for safety. And then the second one is for emotional support and assistance with urgent needs, such as housing or medical. Now we're going to talk about housing. So 86% of the respondents believe that housing resources for domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual assault survivors are insufficient. And that 42% believe that housing is inaccessible to survivors of violence. So there's much work to be done in the area of housing. The top 5 reasons that housing is insufficient is that there's not enough beds or housing option. Housing is is unaffordable. We know this. The cost of living is dramatically going up in the state of Utah, and it is impacting those that are most marginalized. They are also ineligible for some of the services. So the housing options that are there, they might be ineligible for. They're unaware of the housing services. And there continues to be a fear because of anti-immigration sentiment. Transportation is also important. And so here we hear from a victim advocate that says, transportation is an issue. We can try to secure shelter for somebody, but there are very, very limited options when it comes to transportation, getting somebody to a place. And that's a huge barrier that comes up. And we recognize that in the consolidated areas of Salt Lake County area, it might be a little bit easier. But once we start to get out into the more rural areas, it becomes much more challenging for service providers and responders. So now we're going to talk about medical services. So the top 5 reasons survivors seek medical services is for urgent care, substance use treatment, primary care, care for another family member, and reproductive services. The top 5 reasons medical resources are insufficient. And again, people are providing great services, but some of the challenges that people are facing is that they lack health insurance. Medical services are expensive. They may be unaware of the services available. Again, people continue to be fearful because of their legal status. And some believe that they are experiencing bias. So providers have bias. And so that is impacting people's ability to access resources. Here I'd like to quote a victim advocate who says, who talks about a model that is good to them, which is the Urban Indian Health Center, because they incorporate a lot of traditional practices. And so I think that this is really important when we think about how we address some of the bias and some of the challenges that people are experiencing when accessing resources is there needs to be a diversity of what care looks like for them. The top 5 primary reasons that survivors interact with law enforcement is for safety, protection, filing a complaint, aiding in an investigation, aiding in a criminal system, or probation. The top 5 reasons that survivors are afraid to report to law enforcement, or it's difficult to report to law enforcement, is they are fearful because of their legal status. They've experienced maltreatment from law enforcement. They experience bias or discrimination from law enforcement, denied support, or they experience racial profiling. And so there needs to be ongoing conversations and education. That was something that came up. And that one of the other things that came up in the conversations is that there's a lot of turnover, a lot of onboarding of new agents. And so when we know there's new law enforcement agents, how do we start to build those conversations with those new folks? All right. So the top 5 pressing legal needs for domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking survivors are protective or restraining orders, custody of a child, divorce, legal needs related to domestic violence, and the prosecution of their abuser. Legal resources are insufficient. 73% of the respondents believe that. And the top 5 reasons is because it's expensive. Survivors are not aware, that should say unaware of services. They need more staff providers and that they fear services due to their legal status, or they were denied services or support. Some of the things that came up in the discussions during the focus groups and interview are challenges of filing a protective order, the length of time and difficulty, abusers or perpetrators violating protective orders, and that there are differing perceptions of what is justice, and so that there's a need for more options of justice for survivors, and that survivors want justice and education, and so not necessarily just punitive legal responses. All right. So that was a quote about the challenges of the protective order. And then here, this victim advocate is talking about accessing legal services for free and needing it in a range of languages. And when we don't have diverse languages in our organizations, that can make it really challenging and a barrier for survivors. And that there's some organizations that are not supporting survivors because of their legal status, which poses a barrier for survivors who are unauthorized and experiencing abuse. So 1 in 2 believe survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking are unable to have their immigration needs met. And this is a huge barrier. And we saw that throughout the surveys that there continues to be a concern around legal and immigration status or fear of accessing resources because of one's immigration status. Here, an administrator says, the other thing I've written down is our prosecution rate is just dismal for people who want to engage in the system. And so we know that while not everyone wants to pursue the prosecution of their abuser, whether it's domestic violence, sexual violence, or human trafficking, for those that do, it is a challenge. Another area that came up in the conversations are Title IX and campus challenges. And so some of the conversations that were raised was the inability to support students after they've transferred, the difficulty of confidentiality, which conflicts with mandated reporting. So I'm a professor at the University of Utah. I am expected to report. We know that also polyvictimization occurs. And so some of the things that were coming up is how survivors are experiencing stalking, domestic violence, sexual assault, as well as human trafficking also came up, and that these are intersecting issues, that there's difficulties reporting, and that there's a desire for institutional accountability. And that what we see is that, again, with immigration status, is that international students are not entitled to the same support or benefits. And so here an administrator says we had a really rough few years where I can pretty confidently say 100% of our survivors were actively suicidal and had made attempts and told us, and that there were a few times where we had to engage with law enforcement. It's not really gotten better. Right now, I don't know the exact number. We don't see this as much in our employees, but students, and really compounded some intense, complex PTSD. And so we know that people are really dealing with some complex cases when it comes to survivor needs, and that it is impacting the mental wellness of survivors. So now I'd like to talk about prevention and education. We know that a majority of Utah organizations are trained to respond to domestic violence and sexual violence. This contrasts that 42% believe that staff are not sufficiently trained to support survivors of human trafficking. And so we know that the respondents believe that Utah needs to increase violence awareness and prevention. So 75% agreed to this. And that the top 5 reasons education awareness efforts are insufficient is because they're underfunded. There's an absence in rural communities. Survivors are unaware of the efforts. There needs to be more staff and providers. And again, in conversations that were coming up, I'd hear about how somebody was providing care and support in addition to being the advocacy and outreach person. And that we know that communities distrust organizations. And so here we hear from an advocate who says it really starts with society, right? So up until this point, society has had a victim blaming point of view. And so they talk about some examples here. And then they say, so it really comes down to education, right? So if we want to change how we respond and how people are responding, we have to educate. So now I'd like to begin to wrap up the presentation with recommendations. Oops. To be effective, what is needed? Well, we need more funding. We also need organizations to have the funding and resources to have more staff. salaries need to increase, right? And so that's another one. So not just funding that goes directly into the hands of survivors or to support survivors, but really to support the people that are responding to them. We also need to address the culture in Utah, and that we need to improve cooperation between different organizations responding to the need. Here we hear from a lawyer who says we have a lot of great professionals in the state of Utah who are very passionate and dedicated. And I think that's probably one of the best things we have going for them, right? And so that's really important. One government worker said, I would love to create a community where there's no wrong stop, like every stop is the right stop. There were some promising models that were provided in the feedback and conversations with community. Housing First is a model, trauma-informed, diverse justice options, theory-driven, so bringing in feminist, multicultural, critical race theory, indigenous epistemologies. We also saw that another promising model is community partnerships and coalition. People talked about data and data-informed and evidence-based processes. This is really important for moving forward. So some of the recommendations, and again, I look forward to your feedback in the survey link. I'll drop in some of the information there, is that folks, some of the recommendations based on the conversations with community is that we need to increase state resources for services in response to marginalized communities. I named some of the communities that are the most marginalized. We also need systematic data collection. We know that right now a lot of organizations have uneven practices, and this is because they also don't have the resources. We also know that it is also impacts our ability to access resources. And so we do need some form of systematic data collection and the support for that. We also need a resource trauma-informed and culturally informed practices. This came up throughout all of the focus groups where people talked about trauma-informed care and culturally responsive practices. Another recommendation was resourcing flexible funds. A lot of the organizations are bound and restricted in how they can use resources, but when they don't have flexible funds, that means that when the need changes, they can't adapt to those needs. And that many of them had used up all of their flexible fund resources during this past year, which meant that they didn't have a ton of flexibility to support survivors. There needs to be more centralized information sharing. And we see that there's some endeavors to create information sharing by different entities, but this is an ongoing need. And I see somebody is drawing on my thing, if can turn that off. And then we also have a need for training and paying language advocates. So I'm going to stop that. That's so interesting. Okay. Looks like somebody has joined and started to doodle on top of our conversation. And so with that, I'd like to now open it up for conversation. I'm going to stop the share and always love when we have people doodling on our thing. Yeah, it gives it a little life. And so now I'd like to open it up for conversation, questions. I will be revising the infographic today to address some of the typos that I noticed as I was running through it. And would also love to get your input though, because we will be producing a report that is intended for community and it will be made available on the Gender-Based Violence Consortium website. I'm going to go ahead and plop some of the links that to the conversation for all of you. So let's just give me a second. Oh, I see lots of lively conversation. So I'd like to just take a moment to invite you to ask questions or comment. There's a survey link. Let's see. All right, I'm just going to take a minute to skim through some of the comments. All right, great. There is a resource that was shared. I'm going to save that link. Great. I'd like to open it up. any questions or comments? You can go ahead and put your comments in the chat. The question is, can we access the PowerPoint information after this session? You can access a PDF of it on the Gender-Based Violence Consortium website. If you would like the presenter-friendly version of it, you can email me directly at gbvc@utah.edu, and I can go ahead and share with you the presenter one. I would love if you'd love to present my slides elsewhere. I'm happy for other folks to share the information widely. It's for you. So yes, great. So any questions? Okay, so here some victims do not, they're victims, know if they're victims, if, I'm sorry, Brandy Farmer may. Okay, great. So when will the full report be ready to release? That is great. It depends on the kind of feedback I receive in the survey. So if there's some comments that are quite substantive, then it will take me a little bit longer to revise the report. The report's currently in draft form. And so my goal is to get it out by the end of February at the latest, but it really depends again on the kind of feedback I receive from community. This is just the first stage of the report. Right now, through the School for Cultural and Social Transformation, I did apply to hopefully receive foundation funds. If we get it, then we will do a next stage of the study, which will be to hear explicitly from survivors. So not responders who are doing the work day to day, but do a more robust, part two of the needs assessment that is 100% from survivors who may not be responders. They have moved on with their lives. They are working in a variety of fields, are doing what they need to do to live and be a whole human being. And so that's another part of the stage two that we're still waiting. So if we get the resources, then that will be part two. Yeah, so first question is from Dr. Lee Oliver, is what ways do you see the implementation occurring in agencies and or the university? Do you see that as changing campus response and changing policing in critical ways? So do I think the report will change their response in critical ways? It really depends on the institution. And so this information is to give back to community so people can use it when they're advocating for policy changes, when they're advocating for resources. And so you hopefully will take this report, you'll take the presentation and you'll be able to use it to advocate for the changes that need to be made. But at the end of the day, a report can't do anything without people also behind it. And so it does require other people kind of speaking and advocating for that change as well within the institution. I know that at the University of Utah, there have been a ton of endeavors to address some of our failed responses to survivors of violence. And so there have been ongoing changes that our newer offices at Title IX and community organizations have been working. There's new leadership that's happening at the University of Utah that will be happening in the near future with the Women's Resource Center. And so these are some of the endeavors, but it's ongoing. These are ongoing, I think, small steps, and so will it change it in critical ways? The critical ways would require people to want to make critical change. And I think that that is a great question for us in Utah. Yes. Here we have Sonia says, Dr. Solari says, U of U, so the University of Utah and UWC are partnered with the OVW. Yes, that's correct. Campus grant. And so, yes, that's definitely been part of that endeavor that Dr. Solari is leading up to address some of those inadequacies that had happened in our systems before. So there are efforts happening. Other questions or comments? I'm happy to stay on for 30 minutes after the hour. I had made it so the presentation would be for up to the hour and that Q&A would go on for 30 minutes. I totally understand if folks have to pop off, but I'm going to stay here. So please do continue to make comments. Dr. Jericho says, are there optimal examples of community collaboration we can point to and model? Oh man, that's a great question. Yeah, so those are some of the things that I'm hoping to have more fleshed out in the report. And so I love this comment. This is very useful. I know some of the community partnerships and models that I've seen in California. I also think that there are also models in New Orleans that I've been seeing with different entities. And so I'm happy to make sure that those models are brought in where we're seeing different kinds of collaboration. But I think that one of the things that people always think of is that there needs to be a singular collaboration. There should be multiple collaborations happening. In the state of Utah, we know that there are great collaborations happening. And that was actually very clear in the focus groups and interviews that people really do appreciate the collaborations that are happening through UDVC, through Restoring Ancestral Winds, through UCASA, through the localized different kinds of collaborations that they've had. Some collaborations existed, went away. And so those are some of the things that were also coming up. And so I do think that there are multiple collaborations happening. The question becomes, what is the model of collaboration? And I think that one of the things that we know is that folks in the community here are working so hard and are under resourced. And so if you have, for example, one person who has to serve on all the committees and be in all the coalitions, it can stretch them quite thin. And so I do think that that is one of the challenges. And so how do we have it so that coalition becomes something where people can come in where they need and can still get the very information that they need, even if they're not there? That's an ongoing challenge. Let's see. Okay, so all right. And so folks would like my email. So I'm going to go ahead and drop my email in the chat. You can send an email to, here, I'll just put my email because that'll just be the easiest, a quick way to contact me. Great. If you can't copy it, you might not be able to copy it. I do have copy and paste limitations because of my, I don't like, I think there was when I was doing interviews, I didn't want people to copy and paste what other people were writing for privacy reasons. But I can download the chat at the end. So let's see. Great. Thank you, folks. Great. Are there, I'm sorry, hands are up. Please go ahead. Susie, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Annie, for doing this assessment. The thing that stood out in my mind is that the percentage of BIPOC community people that you had involved were very, very low, but yet came out as a big gap. I just can't help but think that if we actually had more BIPOC people involved, how much more that need would have spiked. I think that's what stood out to me in the work that I do. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for doing this, and that there's so much to do yet in our communities. I love the fact that you're saying there doesn't need to be one coalition, but a whole bunch. And that, you got the same 5 people in communities of color doing the same thing in every industry. We have to be able to spread the work or we are all gonna burn out. And when we start over, we don't have the succession plan or the ability, and then the next person comes in and starts all over again, right? Instead of handing the torch over. So I think as an organization or an industry, looking at how we provide training for the actual staff and then also administration in our BIPOC communities to start. I've always felt like we needed to have a coalition for those that were wanting to focus on BIPOC communities. I know that I sit on the Salt Lake Domestic Violence Coalition, which we need lots of help there. But I've also participated in the one in Southern Utah that morphs into something else. We don't have enough coalitions in the state. And that to me is one of the problems that we have around, just generally speaking, not even for BIPOC, but just general service and connection, support, etc. So thank you so much. I look forward to getting a copy of this and using this in my work and sharing it. It's very valuable information. So just wanted to thank you, Annie, for all of your hard work in doing this work.
Thank you. Yeah, and you're right, Susie, about the small percentage. We did work really hard to recruit communities of color to participate in the study. And I think that one of the things that folks should know as a next part that we're doing is I am working with one of my students who is we're going to explicitly reach out to folks in the Latinx community where Spanish is preferred. And that will help us hear from that perspective. But again, I think that when we look at even other populations, such as Asian and Pacific Islander and Black, they were lower participating. But we also know that they are smaller in numbers in the state of Utah. And that doesn't mean that it's not pressing, though, for those very communities. And so, I do think that there is more work to be done, and also training more folks who are from our diverse communities to not just be, translators, but also to end up doing the good work from all levels, from frontline to leadership. And I think that that is that should I love the idea that you're raising, Susie, around BIPOC coalition, because that would be a lovely commitment of just that one kind of a thing of getting more diversity across the ranks in organizations. Yeah.
Annie, one more question that you just bring up when you just said that is there a statistic that you came across showing statistically in usage? Because like in our Pacific Island community, we are overrepresented in the prison system. I
Mhm.
would be curious to see if we're overrepresented, in what BIPOC communities are being overrepresented. I don't know if your data can pull that out as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that in general, yes, the answer is yes. Communities of color, including Pacific Islander, tend to over-index, but I will make sure that appears in the report then. It doesn't appear in this presentation form, but when we do the final report, that's a great suggestion to make sure that kind of information is available. Great suggestion. Um, Other questions or suggestions at this point, please just go ahead and please go ahead and unmute yourself. And you're right, Brandy. Yes, we've been in contact with Colavi. They're another coalition. Yes. Please unmute yourself if you have a question or raise your hand. The unmute is a kind of signal to the rest of us that you are ready to ask a question. So any other questions that folks might have, suggestions, thoughts?
Hello.
Hi, Heather.
Hi. I am so thankful to be here today that I was able to catch this presentation, and you all are very inspiring to me. I'm a survivor of, domestic violence and a lot of these situations, but also have spent the last 7 years providing horsemanship, teaching horseback riding, and doing empowerment work for myself, and just sharing that sort of in a nonprofit way with others. And I recently moved out to Roosevelt, Fort Duchesne area, and I'm trying to just expand my program to serve the community here and educate myself and just connect and network with people like yourselves. And so I'm just really thankful to be here. And I just want to introduce myself, and I'm interested in connecting in any way that we can to with the coalition. If people want to, come and spend time with the horses, or however we can, just thank you so much. So I'm here, and if anybody wants my email or however, you can just shoot me a message.
Oh,
Thank
that's
you.
so lovely, Heather. Thank you for sharing that you're also a survivor. I appreciate that bravery. There's so many survivors in the space, and so I appreciate that. You are not alone. And also, what a wonderful gift to share a resource at a needs assessment of this opportunity. Heather, would you mind just going ahead and putting into the chat for everyone your website or email, whatever you prefer? That would be wonderful for folks to go ahead and get connected. That was one of the other things that I found found super striking about the needs assessment focus groups is sometimes it was the first time people had met each other and that they were sharing resources during the focus groups and interviews. And so I find that super fabulous. So I appreciate that you're modeling that. Thank you for sharing with us your website and for making that available to partners. Yes, and yes, you're right, Dr. Jericho. We should get into the room together, share ideas and solutions. Ongoing, it's ongoing. The work is ongoing. Anyone else would love to comment or share a comment, question?
Hey, Annie, it's Susie again. I one thought that when you were just mentioning that is, could your report also state what time victim services are available from police departments? Because I believe that that shows the strength of the community base, because only Salt Lake City victim advocates are 24/7. Every other police department is Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Like, domestic violence only happens during those times, right? And that is a gap, because that's where the community-based organizations and community victim advocates are picking up the slack in that space. So if we could state that, or if any of your research showed that,
Yeah.
the availability.
That's a great question. We didn't actually ask that question. We could probably go back to one of the other data we were collecting to see if that's in there. That's a good point. I appreciate that, Susie. Otherwise, I can make that comment because I do know that many of you are working all the hours of the day. And here we have from Danae, a resource with Restoring Ancestral Winds. Thank you so much for sharing that. They're a wonderful coalition, and they provide some description. Thank you for the website link. Uinta Basin advocates are also on call 24/7. Hey, folks want to just go ahead and chat your resources, that's great. Thank you. Other questions or comments? Please go ahead and just unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand. So I have popped into the chat a link that I welcome your feedback. If there was anything that was missing that you feel like is very important, the comments that have been shared, I appreciate it. I will make sure to incorporate those. You're welcome to also fill out the survey and add anything that you think should be added that you didn't feel like was represented, questions you have. The other thing is, if there's areas that you felt are very important that you think should be retained or maintained in the report, please offer that as a comment as well. And so this again is just an opportunity for people to comment, offer input for a final report that will be shared with the community with the goal of end of February. Again, please fill out that survey link if you have time. If not, the other thing is, please just stay connected to the GBVC's website. You're welcome to visit the link. I am going to pop the link into the chat. So if I will be updating this, I think should be showing now, where you can download the PDF version of this presentation. And again, I want to thank my partners. Oh, that's a survey link, sorry. Please fill that out. And so this is the link to the website. And yeah, I just want to thank my partners and all of you for your input and insights. Are there any questions?
Annie, this is Jen with UDVC.
Thanks. Hi. Hello.
I just wanted to tell you thank you. Thank you so much for this work and for everything you put together. And thank you for all who participated. And this has just been wonderful to see. And I'm so excited to continue to learn from this and to help inform our work. So I just wanted to tell you thank you. I just really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And thanks for UDVC for being a partner. You've all been so wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for showing up. And we have some questions. Tatum's asking Susie if you are an advocate in Vernal. If so, I could use your contact info. So Susie, if you can put your contact, folks are on the ready to reach out. Great. Well, if there's no other questions, I just appreciate all of you. Please take care of yourself. If you have thoughts or input, please provide it. Continue to keep up the good work, stay connected, and know that there's more coming from the Gender-Based Violence Consortium, and we just appreciate all of you. So thank you.